So sadly, for the afternoon programming, we've reached the final session. And for those out there who are really cold, please don't burn your chairs and stuff to warm up. We'll work on that. But we've got a great conversation to cap off a productive and engaging day. And then, certainly our program this evening will continue in that honor. But we have here author and historian from the Jenny Craig Institute, Dr. Mark Calhoun. He'll discuss his book, General Lesley J. McNair, Unsung Architect of the U.S. Army. Now, Mark's book seeks to restore the general known as one of Marshall's forgotten men to his place in American military history. Now, with us on stage is Dr. John McManus. He will lead the discussion. John, as you know, had a great conversation yesterday with Con, who's of course watching the Army-Navy game now, about the wonderful third volume of John's trilogy. John's been a tremendous friend of the museum, including leading tours overseas to battlefields and sites. We're always delighted to have him here and incredibly honored to have him for this afternoon session. So with John, with that, over to you.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Mark, it's an honor to be with you here today and to talk to some Lesley McNair. So, I mean, maybe the place to begin our conversation, to kind of ease into where he fits in this larger context of the World War II we've been exploring is, what explains U.S. or Allied victory in World War II, and how does that lead us to a discussion of McNair, do you think?
Yeah, so what John isn't telling you is that there's a pop quiz. So we're going to start with...
I'm not doing the grading, by the way.
That's right, we're not grading the pop quiz, though, so it's on your honor system. But take a quick look at these three brief statements, and just think about which one would you choose as the best explanation for the U.S. Victory in World War II. So I drew these from a review essay that a fellow named Christopher Lamb wrote, an analyst at the National Defense University. And he began the review essay with these questions, really to just kind of set up the purpose of the essay and to show that, over time, for one thing, over time narratives and mythologies about the way things happened in the past can change, the predominant narrative shifts, but also that the study of McNair and people like him can really help you see the differences in these different answers and which one you might want to choose. So just something to consider as we go forward. We might revisit it in the Q&A if anybody wants to approach it then.
Yeah, so who is McNair? Where does he come from? And then why did you end up, writing an entire book about him? What led you to that?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and put this up so people can take a look at it. But so McNair I became very interested in him because when I was at I was active duty Army. I retired in 2008. When I was a student at the Command and General Staff College, McNair just kept coming up. We would study Kasserine Pass, for example, and McNair's name always seemed to pop up in these different historical examples when someone needed to explain why the U.S. Army did really badly at something. And it was really intriguing to me. At first, it just made him seem like, okay, this is really an interesting character. But then as I started to hear more about him and read more about him, you find out things like, Marshall's really close affinity to McNair and referring to him as the brains of the Army. And you see the positions that he held, and I couldn't help but wonder why is somebody who's the explanation for so many problems with the World War II U.S. Army continually elevated to more important positions and held in such high regard. So when I went into the project, that's kind of what I wanted to figure out. And I initially had a lot of people discourage me from taking on this project for various reasons, as you can see here on the slide. One of the ones that was most surprising to me is he didn't command in combat. He not troops in the field. He's just a staff officer. So why would he even be interesting to people to write about? But I found his career really, really interesting. And as I started to dig into it, and I found way more references than people said that I would, far more references. And I started to find out that actually, the record shows that many of the criticisms of McNair kind of come from a oversimplification or taking things that he wrote out of context. And many of the sources that I found in the course of my research, I'd never seen referenced in any work anywhere. So I think some of the homework that might have opened up the aperture a little bit and helped people understand him a little bit better, you know, just wasn't there.
Yeah, well, and it seemed like you really had to work harder and dig deeper to get to McNair, because there's not an extensive letters collection. You really couldn't kind of get to know him at a personal level. He doesn't have major papers. Of course, his life is cut short sooner than it should have been. And in order to get the material you did, you really had to do more impressive research than the rest of us would at a normal biography, because you had to dig around in all these various archives in something of the official sources, right? And so you begin to see him, you begin to paint this portrait of him in your book based on this really interesting blend of source material that I think the value of it, of course, is revising how we view his role in World War II, and I think thus the Army's as well.
Yeah, some of the sources, for example, you know, there was a rumor that, a story that Claire McNair, General McNair's wife, burned his papers after his death in her grief. I was surprised when I went to the Library of Congress and checked to see if they had anything on McNair. They had 9 boxes. In the first box, there's a letter from Claire McNair, you know, dedicating this collection in her donation to the Library of Congress, which made me wonder, you know, I'd never seen any of this stuff referenced in any book I'd read. I'm sure other people had looked at it, but for whatever reason, it had never seemed to influence the narrative about General McNair. The other thing about him is he spent the war in D.C. I mean, he was in the field a lot, you know, observing and participating in training and all of that, but he was at home, so he didn't need to write to his wife regularly like, you know, most of the people downrange would have done. And the other thing is he had a really, I mean, he was kind of a workaholic like lots of these officers were. He was at work all the time, and Claire kind of managed the family correspondence for him. So he didn't have a lot of personal correspondence with anyone. Usually the letters I found on McNair were all, you know, there would be friendly introductions and conclusions, and then it would mostly just be about business.
So what's his background? Why does he choose a military career and end up at West Point?
Yeah, so we're going to focus on World War II here for obvious reasons, but this is just a summary of all the things that General McNair did during his career. And I'd say the reason that he joined the Army, General McNair was a very talented student from the very earliest years, and he lived with his family. He was the second child, and they lived in Verndale, Minnesota, in a pretty rural area, a town of 500 people, and his father was in the lumber business, and he had these camps in the woods that he loved. He loved to spend time in the woods, and McNair got through 9th grade. Lesley made it through 9th grade and was a phenomenal student, and that was as far as he could go in Verndale. So his family actually moved to Minneapolis to afford him the opportunity to go to a good high school. And his dream was to get into the Naval Academy, which is really interesting. But you know, when he finished high school in Minnesota, he applied to the Naval Academy, and the waiting list was so long that he took additional courses to try to, you know, college courses to try to further his education while he's waiting to hear from the Naval Academy. And finally, after a year and a half, he gives up and applies to West Point, and they take him right away. But he had wanted to be in the service his whole life. And then if you take a look at the things that he did, I mean, it's kind of a typical career in some ways for interwar officers of his kind of age and seniority. You know, Civilian Conservation Corps assignments, the Funston Expedition and the Punitive Expedition. Lots of folks his time period were involved in those things. But one of the unique things about it is that very early on, that intellect of his, you know, at West Point, he was one of the best students in math, ordnance design, drawing. He graduated 11th in his class, and those courses, those subjects were also very high, around the top 10 of his class. And so his second assignment there is an ordnance assignment. He actually spent a year out west at Fort Douglas, field artillery, but he applied for a branch detail to ordnance. Now, part of the reason might be because that branch detail took him to the East Coast, and Claire was on the East Coast, and he hadn't married her yet. He married her very quickly after he got out there. But during that 4-year assignment, he spent a lot of time working on how ordnance did the various kinds of tests and field studies that they used to develop equipment. And he had a huge talent for it. So that really kind of shaped his career thereafter. So you'll see assignments where it says he's a commander. For example, 2nd FA Brigade, 1937 and 1939, right on the eve of the war. He is the commander of the 2nd Field Artillery Brigade, but he's also the chief of staff of the 2nd Division, which is the Provisional Infantry Division. And McNair is basically the man responsible for designing the tests of the Triangular Infantry Division. So he's responsible for the redesign of the Infantry Division. And he's there, you know, doing that while he's in command. And you see this same kind of thing throughout his career, where this skill and talent with ordnance and math and doing objective tests, comparative studies, it continued to kind of shape his career thereafter. And then it, you know, I guess one of the big takeaways for me of all of that is each time I kind of looked into a specific area where McNair had a big influence on something in the Army, and I had read in the past that he wasn't really qualified to do those things, I would find these experiences that he had that absolutely qualified him to do them. For example, umpiring the Army maneuvers in Louisiana and the Carolinas and Tennessee. You know, I'd read that he wasn't qualified to be an umpire in maneuvers, and then I found at the War College he was the lead umpire for his War College class. You know, when they did their exercises, he was the lead umpire for the 3rd Army in 1938, I believe it was. So before the Louisiana maneuvers even really got going, he had probably more experience umpiring maneuvers than most of the officers in the Army.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out to me when you look at his career path and trajectory, you see this kind of pattern of exceptional competence and value. I mean, right from his cadet days that he's acing math. Most of the time when you look at you know, the experiences of future generals, they're like, well, they had a tough time getting by in math or in chemistry or whatever. It's usually one of the STEM fields. McNair has no trouble with the academics, and then he's always seems to be kind of ahead of the curve. The example is, you know, you show in World War I. I mean, he becomes really quite indispensable to General Pershing as one of his influential proteges. He's a 1-star general, temporary, of course. By the end of the war, yeah, there he is getting decorated. They're constantly relying on him. He gets coveted spots at the Command and General Staff College, at the Army War College. These were things that were not happening for an everyday officer. But when you look at like a lot of other biographies, you know, Bradley or Patton or Eisenhower or Ridgway or whatever, they end up in command somewhere, you know, in a key spot in World War II. McNair has a kind of different career path, although he's always ahead of the curve like they are too.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
and he you know, this is a very small army. You know, the post-World War I interwar army was a very small army, and he knew all of these people. He had known them for a very long time and developed very close relationships with them. Another thing, you know, from McNair's World War I experience, I drew another counterintuitive lesson from it. I've read before that General McNair was trapped in a World War I mindset during his, you know, his career during World War II. And that really stunted his thinking and caused him to make some bad recommendations. But one of the things that McNair clearly took from World War I was that we absolutely need to move forward. We need to modernize the Army. We need to do away with these giant square divisions. You know, after the war, there's a superior board that writes a report, and they basically, I mean, to oversimplify it a little bit, but they kind of come to the conclusion that we pretty much did everything about right, and we don't really need to change very much of what we did. And General Pershing ends up writing a wrapper endorsement. It takes him 6 months, so it delays the issuance of the report for 6 months. And then he puts the wrapper endorsement on and essentially just discredits what these folks had just written in their Superior Board report. And he says, no, we need smaller, lighter, more powerful, but more mobile divisions. We need modernized equipment. We need artillery that can move forward with the infantry as it attacks, so that the infantry doesn't just push forward a little bit and then we have to pause and laboriously bring everything forward. I mean, these were very kind of forward-thinking ideas. And you know, General Pershing talked a lot about open warfare during World War I. And the reality was that we weren't really able to train open warfare effectively before the war as we're preparing for World War I. And we didn't really, we weren't able to do it in the way it was envisioned. But it became an aspiration. You know, as we move forward and we modernize, this is what we want to be able to do. And so you see in as late as 1939, General Marshall, with McNair appointed to go be the commandant of the Command and General Staff School, writes to him and says, I'm really pleased that you're there because I know that you're going to be able to imbue open warfare thinking onto this organization that's really kind of stuck in the past. So, you know, again, these kind of conflicting things. The narrative says he was stuck in a World War I mindset and kind of had this archaic way of looking at warfare, but the historical record says the exact opposite.
No, he's really quite an innovator. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt, and I think your book shines a great light on that. And you made another really interesting point. This is a small army. It's a place where everybody knows everybody in the officer corps to some extent. So he's had relationships that he's developed over time, none more productively, of course, than George Marshall. And so I just wanted to throw a few names at you. Marshall, MacArthur, Eisenhower. What's the nature of his relationship with these really influential figures then?
Yeah, so Marshall, I think with Eisenhower, I'll start with Eisenhower. I think with Eisenhower there was a mutual respect, but I don't think they really got to know each other all that well. I mean, they obviously interacted quite a bit, but they kind of ran in a little bit different circles. You know, when Eisenhower was with the War Department, he was in the Operations Division, which was, you know, separate from the General Headquarters and then the Army Ground Forces later. So they knew each other, obviously, but they weren't very close. I think with Marshall, the relationship was much closer. I think they thought very much alike, and they shared ideas about how should we shape our force and how should we train our personnel, how should we equip the force. They really had a long-standing exchange of ideas. With MacArthur, he's really kind of absent from the record in terms of the things that I found about General McNair. You'd probably have more insight as to his relationship with MacArthur than I do. But I know that, you know, all of these folks, you know, one of the things that McNair was responsible for was recommending which officers should command these units as we create divisions and we get ready to send them to the field. The same was true for Corps commanders and even recommending commanders for Field Army Command. So he traveled to all of these maneuvers and participated in training, and he got to know all of these people, not just personally, but also in seeing their performance in these really stressful situations. And so he knew everyone, and because he had been involved in sort of this intellectual development of the Army for the past 20 years over the interwar period, he had exchanged ideas with all of these folks, and they would continue to correspond with him and share ideas with him and send him feedback and all of that.
That's exactly. I mean, you know, of course, what we know him best for is being head of Army Ground Forces, and in that capacity, this is just fascinating, I think. One of the things I found is how much correspondence there was between field commanders and McNair. Two examples I'll give you off the top of my head. Robert Eichelberger, who's in touch with him the whole war, and kind of relating to him, here's what's happening on the fighting front. Oscar Griswold, who isn't very well known, but ought to be, the commander of 14th Corps in the South Pacific and later on in the Philippines, he too is sending some really descriptive correspondence to McNair going back and forth. All right, so that takes time and it takes trust, I think, because you know, you're basically reporting to the guy who heads up the branch you're sort of part of, Army Ground Forces, telling him exactly what you're up to. And so what I have to assume from that is that they have a prior relationship that is productive. And so, you know, that, to me, that's just kind of a microcosm of how he's in touch with these commanders. So what's the nature of how he's sort of running this global war in that sense of being in touch with these guys and influencing them? Yeah,
I think it really comes down to McNair was in this odd situation during the World War II where he was the chief of staff of General Headquarters and then later the commander of Army Ground Forces, but neither of those positions, they had a huge amount of responsibility but no command authority. You know, the AGF, Army Ground Forces, Army Air Forces, and Army Service Forces were functional commands. And you know, you think about, for example, General Arnold was on the Combined Chiefs of Staff. General McNair was, even when he was the commander of Army Ground Forces, in many ways his role was almost more of a chief of staff to General Marshall, just by the nature of his responsibilities. I mean, when he was with General Headquarters, he was supposed to be the commander of, in theory, it was based on post-World War I thinking that a headquarters that would actually go forward and deploy to theater when it was time to send a task force into theater, but he was the chief of staff of that organization. So I think he had a huge amount of influence, but it was indirect and it wasn't any kind of authoritative kind of ability to make changes. So I think people knew that he was someone that they could share ideas with, and if they communicated with him about a challenge that they were facing or a question that they had, something that they thought they needed support or a change in policy, that he would be a person who would be a really strong advocate for him, even though he didn't necessarily have the authority to make a decision himself. It's
a heck of a spot to be in.
That's right.
All that responsibility, but not that much accompanying authority.
That's right.
And then to get blamed by historians later for everything that goes wrong.
It was extremely frustrating.
It's really thankless in that sense. So just in case for anyone who doesn't know, like the basic structure of the Army during the war, and you have a really interesting slide about like the staff composition and all that. The Army is basically the Army Air Forces, which might have one foot out the door for independence, of course, and Hap Arnold runs that basically as a peer of George Marshall and Ernie King, as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You've got Army Service Forces, which of course has this vast responsibility all over the globe for all the logistical side of the war and whatever else, and Army Ground Forces, which, I hope this isn't a controversial statement, but I'm just telling you, it does the vast majority of the fighting and dying for the United States in World War II.
Absolutely.
And yet, what you've shown, Mark, is just the sort of the paucity of human resources and authority that's invested in Army Ground Forces, which is carrying the load of this war effort on so many levels, and that falls on McNair.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And so these charts, I know they're eye charts. They're from the green books. You can take a look at them in detail if you want. But I have a blue circle around General Marshall and a green circle around General McNair. This is the slide after the March of 1942 reorganization. This one, I got to double click there. Again, blue circle is Marshall, green is McNair. So this is when he's Chief of Staff of the General Headquarters. So, when you're a Chief of Staff of an organization that doesn't have a commander, it's really, really hard to get anything done. Planners don't make decisions. Chiefs of staff don't make decisions. They make recommendations. They run organizations. So he wasn't in a position at GHQ. And the other thing is GHQ's theoretical combat role, he was completely unresourced for it. So he was resourced to train this newly mobilizing army that we're putting together. And that was really all his headquarters was resourced to do. And the same, and I've got red circles there. That's just to highlight a couple notes that all procurement except aircraft falls under the Undersecretary of War, and aircraft procurement falls under the Undersecretary of War for Air. So at GHQ, McNair has no direct role in procurement. Obviously, is a voice that is asked to make recommendations and to opine on decisions that they're considering, but he doesn't have any authority. And here, when we do the reorganization, as John described, you have there at the bottom, on the bottom right, the AGF, AAF, and Services Supply, which was later renamed Army Service Forces. And again, the red circle shows the procurement line, under Secretary of War down to Commanding General of the Services of Supply, or ASF. So both the AAF and ASF managed to retain a direct role in the development of their own equipment. And this was something that was denied Army Ground Forces. And yet, as you said, General McNair is overseeing and directing and commanding the largest force and the forces suffering the most casualties at the front. And so these limitations on his ability to act and on his limited authority were very frustrating. And this is just kind of the frustrations really grew. Now, this is just an example of all the different things that General McNair's got going on. I know you probably can't read it, but you have a ground staff there just underneath the green circle. So he's got a G1 through G4 kind of Napoleonic staff, as all the other functional headquarters in the War Department do. He also has a huge special staff that's responsible for all these different aspects of what the Army needs to be able to do, the ground forces. And then he has a whole bunch of commands down there in the bottom. So the Armored Command, the Tank Destroyer Center, all of these different organizations. But again, these are more oversight than direct control type situations that he's dealing with. And then over to the side, he's got statistical section, historical section. And one of the really interesting things about this is how tiny his staff actually was. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So just take a look at these numbers a little bit. In April 1942, look at the difference in the number of officers authorized to the 3 functional commands, and then the total number of personnel authorized. From 724 for the Army Ground Forces to do all of those things that I just described briefly on that previous chart. And the ASF has over 37,000 people on its staff. And that only grows by December 1943, I mean, significantly. So McNair, this was by choice. McNair wasn't competing to have the same size staff as these other folks, and he was denied it. General McNair was a huge opponent of overhead. And the overhead that you see reflected on these staffs also was reflected in the forces in the field. So the bottom chart or table there shows the percentage of overhead, which is defined as folks who aren't in direct combat roles. In the Army Ground Forces, all but 4.1% of the personnel are involved in some kind of combat role. And you can see the numbers there. Army Air Forces, a third of the Army Air Force is in a non-combat overhead type role, and 22% for the ASF. And I've got a quote here. So McNair actually wrote about this. American soldiers were sustaining avoidable casualties because their natural leaders, quote, or parentheses, of course with exceptions, sat at desks or tended machines well behind the lines. And we've all heard the phrase war of machines, you know, and absolutely technology was a hugely important factor in World War II. But the idea that it's a war of machines led to some pretty questionable decisions about who do we want to recruit, and of those recruits, which recruits do we want to put in certain jobs? How much do we value the role of, say, the infantry as compared to these other parts of the military? And McNair was in this really frustrating position where he was in charge of this really hugely important part of the military, but every signal that was sent to him was kind of saying, we don't really see it as all that important.
At the higher level.
Right.
And to me, that's a microcosm of how the U.S. tries to approach World War II, and really, I would argue, almost ever since, saying, okay, well, wars just aren't really going to be fought on the ground as much anymore. It's going to be all these other things we'll do. We'll expend our technology, our material, our sea power, our air power, all vitally, vitally, vitally important things. But one of the lessons they learned in World War II in my view, we really haven't taken to heart ever since, is that when you really get to the core of it, of what a war is and what is required for winning it, whatever our strategy, whatever our purpose is, it tends to be on the ground. And when you look at that staff number, that is an incredibly lean staff for Army ground forces, which every infantry and armored division, all the tank battalions, the tank destroyer battalions, the anti-aircraft units, all that is part of Army ground forces that's all over the globe fighting this war. So think about all the human capital that's invested elsewhere, and that's encompassed in this McNair quote. Right. And that's what he's kind of pushing back against through the whole war. And so I think when you see it in that context, you really start to kind of become impressed with what he's able to accomplish. You know, so what's the rhythm of his work life as he goes through the war? And so how's he interacting with the staff and having the kind of influence that he does, and working with Marshall too, all the same thing. Right.
Well, so as I mentioned, he was a workaholic. He would generally type his own correspondence. He had I think his typewriter was called Daisy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well.
But he had, you know, he was a very hardworking, you know, lead by example, hardworking kind of officer. He was deaf. By World War II, he was stone deaf. I mean, he could make out conversation in a small setting, but he didn't like large meetings. You know, earlier in his career, you see him like at the after-action review from a maneuver in one of the Army-level maneuvers, and he's sitting in a large theater with all of his peers, all the other, you know, the generals and colonels and NCOs involved in these maneuvers, and they're laughing and have a good time. But later in his career, he really didn't enjoy those kind of large settings. I think he was a pretty formal person. I wouldn't say that, I don't think he was cold. I think he was warm, but it was a warmness that was sort of completely embedded within his professionalism. Mm-hmm. You know, I think he was the kind of officer that people would say is, you know, really maybe professional, but a little bit distant. And by the end of the war, he's also extremely frustrated. There's a thing towards the end of my book, there's a meeting he has with his staff at the Army Ground Forces after he's been ordered to go to the front, and we should probably talk about that next. He said he's going to say farewell to his staff, and at this point, he has written in a letter that I found to a colleague. It's mostly a letter about work, as I mentioned, but there was the personal element. And in one place, he says, this is in 1944, he says, you know, I don't know that we're winning this war, and sometimes it feels to me like we're doing everything we can to lose it. I mean, and so there were times when to his friends, he would be open and honest about these things and these frustrations that he had. But the story about him going to the front, I think, is really interesting as well. McNair was absolutely a soldier's officer. He loved training. He loved the field. He had absolutely physical courage was not an issue for General McNair. He had no fear, maybe to the point that it was a little bit naive. And you can see that kind of play out in what happens with him when he goes to the front. Let's go forward a little bit.
Yeah, so he'd already been wounded in North Africa.
That's right. And so this is really cool. This is something I love to get to. As you can see, this is a tactical map. It says it's from North Africa. I found this on my very first research trip. I'd been to the archives before as a young major in the Army, but this was my first research trip looking into General McNair. Timothy Nenninger, if anybody knows Tim Nenninger, he's a fixture at the National Archives. I saw him when I was there just a few months ago. It's unbelievable. He's still working there. He helped me prepare for this research trip, and when I got there, he said, Mark, you might see the greatest find I've ever had in the archives. I'm not going to tell you what it is or where it is exactly, but it's in the records that you've requested, so we'll see if you find it. So I open, it's record group 337, the contents of General McNair's office when he's killed at the front. They basically took all of his file cabinets and desk drawers, and they put all the paperwork in boxes and sent it off to be stored, and it made its way to the archives. The first box I opened, I got into a folder, opened the folder, and there's a manila envelope kind of glued to the inside of this folder. So I open the envelope, and I pull this folded up paper, and it's this map. So I unfold the map. As you can see, there are stains on it. So I saw right away there's General McNair's name in pencil at the top. It's a 1 to 50,000 tactical map depicting a combat action, a low-level tactical combat action. But there's this stain across it, and I felt it, and you can actually feel the tactile. So it didn't take me long to realize this is the map that General McNair was holding when he was observing this attack, and Germans spotted his party and started engaging them with artillery, and General McNair was wounded in the head and the arm while he was holding this map. And so he kept the map. Somebody actually held on to it for him when they evacuated him. They gave it to him, and it was in his office, in his records. And the map is still folded up in this folder at the National Archives. When I was looking at it, Tim Neninger, he came over and we're talking, and next thing you know, there are 4 or 5 archivists, one with a museum background, all around the table, and arguing about whether this map should be in the archives so that historians like me could see it and touch it, or if it should be under glass in a museum somewhere. It was a really interesting debate. I know how huge an impact it had on me, so I think I kind of lean to the it's where it belongs view. But
yeah, I would too. Yeah, exactly. I mean, selfishly, I guess.
That's right. But, it probably is kind of selfish. Yeah.
But it is an amazing find. And so he's combat wounded. He comes back. Claire meets him at the airport in D.C. and he works, for the next year or so in the same kind of situation. But he also is drawn to the front in some respects, and he's about to transition to a new job during the Normandy campaign. So he's there in Normandy in July 1944. What's he, why is he there? What's he about to do? And then, how does this lead to his ultimate demise?
Right, and this one's a really interesting one to me. That the fact that most people are unaware that the reason General McNair was at the front was that he had been selected for Field Army Command. And this is in General Eisenhower's papers, correspondence with General Marshall. There were 2 field armies that might need a commander. The first was actually the 1st U.S. Army Group. The deception operation, General Patton is the commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group. This deception has worked far longer than we thought it would, to the point that we're now at the point where General Patton needs to bring his 3rd Army over the beach and into the war, but the deception's still working, and so it makes sense to keep the deception going. And if Patton leaves with no explanation, then obviously it gives it away. The other opportunity for Field Army Command was the 15th Army, which didn't form until December. Quite a bit later, and they needed McNair right away to do the 1st U.S. Army Group job. So to make the deception work, they said, well, go tour the front, and they set up this tour so that he would get plenty of media attention. And one of the interesting things to me is they chose McNair for this because they knew he had a profile that could kind of match General Patton's. If the Germans heard somebody of a much lower stature than Patton had become this 1st U.S. Army Group commander, then again, it's going to weaken the deception. McNair was seen as one of the people who, A, was qualified for Field Army Command, and B, that he had the sort of the gravitas to actually replace Patton in this role. But then he goes forward for Operation Cobra, so let's see. So what was McNair doing at St. Lo? Well, Operation Cobra, as you know, this is a map that shows the, I guess I can use the laser pointer here. This is the engagement area where the strategic bomb drop that General Bradley has planned with the air planners. That's where they plan to saturation bomb the Germans before they attack from north to south, right? So the U.S. forces are lined up here, and they're going to attack to the south. So the bombers are going to come in, and one of the things that General Bradley did, so here's the engagement area, and here's the front lines, U.S. troops here, and they're going to attack to the south. And General Bradley actually made a very bold decision, as I'm sure most of you know, to bring the edge of that box much closer to the front lines than they'd ever done before, 1,200 meters. He initially wanted 800, and other folks were so concerned about the danger that they convinced him to move it up to 1,200 meters, which is still very close. The other thing, though, is at this planning meeting, this is purely General Bradley and General Collins's plan. I mean, they've come up with this thing, and they've got the air planners in the room with them, and they're talking about this preparatory bombardment. And one of the things that General Marshall or General Bradley is convinced is going to help make it safe. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, actually, that's actually not a bad one. So here's a blown up image of the engagement area. You see this road right here. This road runs from Saint Lô to Perrières, and it also runs parallel to the long axis of the engagement area. And so the idea that Bradley has is the airplanes can fly in, follow this road, which any of us aviators know is the easiest way to find out where you're going, figure out where you're going, and then they'll be able to accurately locate the engagement area and drop their bombs accurately. Well, there's a real problem with this, and that is that if you think about it, if you try to bring in the bombers this way, then you can put a whole bunch of bombers side by side simultaneously, and you can get the whole flight of bombers over the engagement area, their bombs dropped and out of the area very quickly. If you try to bring them in this way, along the long axis, you can only get maybe a third or a quarter as many bombers side by side, so you're going to triple or quadruple the amount of time it takes to do the bombing. The weird thing about the planning meeting is they basically talk past each other, and everybody leaves the room thinking that they've got the agreement that they wanted. Bradley thinks they've agreed to the parallel approach, and their air planners think that they've convinced Bradley that they can't do it. So on the morning of the 24th, General McNair's at the front. There's been a bunch of, trying to make it known that he's there. There's been enough attention that the Germans should be aware that he's there, if not right away, soon. And he goes out to the front near the 30th Division positions and occupies a foxhole. Predictably, the bombers come in, and the bomb drop because they're coming in from north to south, and dust obscures the ground. There's bad weather, various things, and then there's an accidental release of one of the stick leads, and so a whole stick of bombers drops all their bombs, and they all they land on top of American troops. McNair has kind of a close call on the 24th, but he's fine. Not true for a lot of the soldiers that were affected by this short drop. So he returns back to the headquarters. General Bradley's despondent and angry. How could this have happened? How did the aviators not understand what I want them to do? And so they decided to reschedule it for the next morning. And General McNair wasn't going to go back out the next morning. But after he'd met with some folks there at headquarters, he went to get some chow, and he encounters some soldiers on the way. And these soldiers told him, "Hey, sir, you have no idea how much it meant to us to see you at the front. It's great to have a general officer who's willing to accept some of this risk that we're facing. And so it really meant a lot to us that you were there." So this changes his mind, and he decides to go back the next morning. He goes back the next morning. The same thing happens with the bombers. The bombs, again, there's short drops. The casualties are actually much worse on the second day. And this time, General McNair doesn't survive. And as we know, Operation Cobra actually turned out really well. But the Bradley's thought on the 25th is, okay, this has been a failure. What are we going to do now? We have to go back to square one and figure out what we're going to do. General Collins is actually initially just moving to try to regain his start positions in case we reschedule the mission for the next day. He sees that the Germans are even more devastated by the bombs, many of which did land on the Germans, as we are, and sees an opportunity and exploits it. And within about 24 hours, Bradley goes from thinking it's over and a failure to realizing, oh, this is actually working out.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add, just before we get to audience questions, to close the loop on the McNair family. So he and Claire had one child, I think, and it was Douglas, their 37-year-old son, who was a colonel at this point, was chief of staff of the 77th Infantry Division, which was fighting in the Battle of Guam that late July 1944. So a little less than 2 weeks after General McNair is killed by friendly bombs, Colonel Douglas McNair, whom you see there in the image, was killed on August 6, 1944, as he was wont to do, sort of like his father. He was no stranger to danger. And he was at the front trying to find a good spot for a new division command post because the division was constantly on the move at that point in the Battle of Guam. He and 2 other soldiers end up encountering some bypassed Japanese soldiers who were holed up like in a shack or some kind of small structure, and they have this sort of brief firefight, and Colonel Douglas McNair was shot right through the throat and killed instantly. So in that 2-week period, Claire loses her husband and her only son. And so lest we think this is just a story about, you know, people in high places who don't pay the price or whatever, I mean, this is a very human story of what McNair contributes, certainly organizationally to the Army and everything else, but also 2 people who sacrificed their lives for ultimate victory in World War II. I think it's really, really poignant.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, when Claire finds out about Lesley, her husband, dying, she was in a gym volunteering for the Red Cross rolling bandages, and somebody comes in and whispers in her ear and takes her away. And then, of course, you can imagine when she finds out about Doug 12 days later, it was absolutely devastating. And the other thing is the Army sought to suppress the news of McNair's death at the front because, again, the deception, we need to find another person to come in and fill in for him at 1st U.S. Army Group. So that the deception continues to work. So there was all of this. And then after the war, General McNair, he was a lieutenant general and wasn't promoted to 4-star until 1954 by an act of Congress. So after the war, Claire only had a $50 a month pension, and she went to work for the Department of State. And it wasn't until he was promoted to 4-star posthumously that she had enough of a pension to actually be able to make ends meet.
Yeah, and this is the wife of one of the highest ranking officers in the United States Armed Forces. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, amazing stuff. Well, I think we ought to open up to some audience questions. If
a round of applause. Gentlemen, we're going to start to your right, near the front and middle.
Thank you. Mark, I think it's a terrific book, and I think it's going to be a terrific read. I'm curious about the General's role in the development of the detached anti-tank battalions and his whole philosophy about how to counter the German blitzkrieg. If you could comment on that.
Sure. This is one of the case studies that, I think many people who've read anything about McNair have heard about, the whole anti-tank idea. So McNair's involvement in the idea of gunnery, whether it's field artillery or direct fire, started very, very early in his career. He was designing modifications to the mountain artillery 2.95-inch howitzer in the 20s. In the 30s, he's working on anti-tank doctrine. I mean, there was kind of an informal approach toward doctrine writing during the interwar period. There was a formal aspect to it, but folks could also really get involved in doctrine writing just because it was something that they were interested in doing, and McNair was involved in that for a long time. So he, kind of his idea, McNair thought about the organization and equipping of the Army as a system. And so rather than trying to have these boutique, high-quality pieces everywhere, the focus was more on how do we make all these different parts of the military organization work as well as they can together. So one of the things that McNair would generally say, and he's reflective of a large percentage of other Army officers in his thinking, that the best gun on the battlefield is always going to defeat the best armor on the battlefield. You can strive to build a tank that can't be defeated by enemy tanks because it's got so much armor, but just the science and engineering of it says that these huge tanks are going to be so hard to develop and so hard to deploy, and it's so much simpler to make a really good gun that the guns are always going to be able to defeat the best tanks. So let's focus on keeping the Army light and mobile, being able to respond efficiently. The old school way of using anti-tank weapons was just to put them in a stationary cordon in a defensive position, or to use them kind of to start an attack, and then they just kind of stay where they are or get brought forward slowly later. And his thinking is, no, we need to have guns that can actually move and be mobile. And it also, the same thinking applied to his ideas about tanks themselves. The idea of needing a heavy tank, which became sort of a priority later in the war when you start to see more Panthers and Tigers in Germany. Again, this whole idea of do you need a great tank to defeat an enemy tank, or do you need an effective system? All of this stuff is driven largely by the huge shortage of shipping that we have at the beginning of the war. The first section of Eisenhower's official papers is titled, "All I Need is Ships," because ships was his #1 concern. So rushing to a heavier tank that kind of, McNair's philosophy said it probably isn't an efficient use of our resources anyway, would also have drastically complicated our ability to deploy. So the anti-tank guns, the M10, the tank destroyers, these were attempts at efficiency, and all the other major powers had these same kinds of equipment. It wasn't anything all that unique, but the uniqueness for us was to try to find a way to have an offensive capability, a mobile, fast-moving anti-tank capability that didn't just rely on these really hugely expensive and difficult to maintain heavy tanks to defeat the enemy's tanks. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
Next question is going to be to your far left at the front, please.
In a previous symposium, General Fox Connor was presented. What was the relationship between McNair and General Connor?
So Fox Connor, I think, again, I didn't come across much evidence that they had much direct interaction. Fox Connor obviously had a huge influence on General Eisenhower and General Eisenhower's thinking. And through that, I think an indirect, even on officers that might not have worked closely with them, an indirect influence on them as well. One thing, it's a little bit of an esoteric doctrinal issue, but General McNair was very aware of the relationship between politics and war, and he was very aware of the fact that you have to have a government and an economy and a procurement system and all of these different capabilities that could work together to create an effective military. And so when the 1939 Field Service Regulations are being drafted, he's the commandant of the Command and General Staff School. And one of the things that he's promoting is kind of this idea of connecting Army operational doctrine to achieving the political object of the war, which you hadn't really seen in Army doctrine before. And that kind of thinking, I think, Fox Connor was one of the people who really helped bring that to the senior officer corps in this period.
Next questions to your far right, towards the front, please.
One of the big discussions that was happening at the end of the 30s and into the beginning of the 40s was how big should the Army be? And the result of that was the so-called 99 Division Compromise. How involved in that was McNair?
Right, so that was primarily an outcome of General Wiedemeyer's research. There was a period where the War Department, folks in the War Department thought we would need as many as 250 or 300 divisions. Wiedemeyer lands on a number more around 200. And initially, that's guiding our mobilization process, that victory plan and that number of divisions. So General McNair isn't necessarily directly involved in developing the victory plan, but it absolutely has a huge influence over his job because he's the person responsible for bringing these recruits in and forming them into divisions and getting them trained and ready to go to the front. It's not that long after we're in the war, in mid-42, where we have this huge manpower crisis, 330,000 personnel short of what we needed to meet our troop bases for that year. So already in 1944, we're looking at somewhere around 20 to 25 divisions fewer production than we hoped we would be able to do. And so this causes the shift, as you mentioned, to the 90 Division Gamble. We actually end up making, I think it's 89 divisions or 90 divisions, and 88 of them actually make it to the front. So a drastic difference, which kind of leads us into the replacement program, as opposed to having 2 divisions for every one at the front so that you can keep replacing divisions as they get tired. And so a big difference from the victory plan's original vision. But the replacement system, it's been criticized by a lot of historians, but there have also been some really good historians who've been pretty supportive of it. Jeffrey Rush wrote that the way to have effective divisions is to sustain them while they're at the front, not to let them get worn down, and then take them out and rebuild them and then move them back to the front again. So there were mismanagements in the replacement process and the system itself that made it inefficient and problematic. But the concept itself, especially once AGF took it over in 1944, it actually worked really well after that.
Yeah, I mean, the system was sort of heartless in terms of sending individuals forward, sometimes without knowing anybody, and throwing them into combat. But really, in the end, it worked in terms of sustainment and certainly firepower and the management of human resources.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Next question is to your left, towards the front.
Thank you very much. I currently live in Watertown, Massachusetts, just west of Boston. McNair spent 3 years early in his career at the Arsenal there. What did he do, and how important was that in terms of his overall career?
Sure, no, that's a great question. So that's where he had his 4-year branch detail and ordnance branch. He wasn't at Watertown the whole time. He spent a year at the ordnance branch headquarters, kind of doing administrative stuff, and then he spent a lot of time at the Arsenal. A couple interesting things from that. One is he got the only negative OERs, officer evaluation reports, that he ever received in his whole career. He was a young lieutenant, and he worked for a captain that they clearly just didn't get along. I mean, the comments were very petty, sort of cheap shot type comments. But that aside, I think he had a really positive experience. He was immersed in this sort of objective, analytic development process that his natural abilities with math and drawing and everything it had really attuned him for that. And so it was at this Arsenal where McNair developed the skills that he used throughout the rest of his career in, running boards that evaluated different types of equipment. He developed, for example, early in his career, the pack saddle that the mountain field artillery used. Mountain artillery, the Aparejo saddle it injured the mules, and you had to have civilian contractors to load them and unload the pack saddles because they were so complicated. So McNair is a commander of one of these field artillery batteries, and he takes them on a several 100-mile road march, and he's testing several different saddles, one of which he designed himself with his soldiers. They figured out how to make a saddle that was an improvement over. So he learned how to do all this stuff while he was on this branch detail, and it absolutely influenced his thinking and the nature of his work for the rest of his career.
Did they adopt the saddle, Mark?
No. And again, I mean, this was 1907, I don't know, very early in his career, and this is the first of many, many, many times where he's going to be asked to do something like this, and then ordnance or some other part of the Army that he doesn't have any influence over is going to ignore his findings.
To your right, halfway back, please.
Terrific conversation here. I just have a question, multiple question. There was a picture of McNair and General Pershing in the start of your program, and I'm wondering when that took place and if he's getting a decoration or whatever. And I also like to know, what was his personality like? Was he like a Patton or more like Eisenhower, and is it true that, my last part of it, is it true that they only found his class ring after he was killed?
Okay, so Pershing. So with Pershing, so that image was General McNair receiving so he received the DSM and the Croix de Guerre. I didn't have the picture of him receiving that for Pétain. But McNair, he was the youngest brigadier general in the Army during the First World War I, and he was on General Pershing's staff. He was in charge of artillery training for the AEF staff. So we worked very, very closely with General Pershing, and he really shared a lot of ideas with General Pershing. He was a forward-thinking person. He understood the idea behind the open warfare concept, even if the reality of it wasn't exactly what Pershing and other folks had intended it to be. And he also had this kind of strict discipline that you see from General Pershing. What he didn't have was, Pershing, if he had an issue with a commander, he was ruthless in removing that commander from his headquarters. And I think General McNair, because his career had such an emphasis in training and development of leaders, that I think he was a little more likely to be understanding of things and try to help people along. On the other hand, he was one of the people most responsible for saying that almost none of the National Guard commanders should remain in command of their units when they were formed and mobilized into active duty divisions. So he was extremely disciplined. He could be kind of cold. He was driven by objective analysis. I don't think he wasn't a real emotional person. I mean, he was in a lot of ways he was the opposite of General Patton. Just the discipline and the ability to control his emotions and and the desire to remain objective and to be fair to everybody. I mean, it was just a very different approach. And again, I think in many ways he looked an awful lot like General Pershing in that respect. And then, yeah, as far as when he was killed at the front, it was pretty much a direct hit on his foxhole. And immediately his aide and his pilot, or 2 aides and his pilot, went to try to find him, and they couldn't find any evidence of where he had been. They went back to the headquarters, First Army headquarters, and they said, hey, here's what's happened. And after things settled down a little bit, they sent a search party out. And some distance away from where he had actually been, I've heard ridiculous estimates of hundreds of yards, but some distance away, they did find an epaulette and his West Point class ring, and I had the photo of the ring. They have it at West Point in the archives there. Did I answer all your questions?
Personality.
Yeah, so yeah, I think I got to the personality thing as well. I mean, I hesitate to comment too much on his personality because I think he could be a really warm, friendly, funny person. But I think he was just more comfortable in a professional setting. I don't think he really knew. If you read something like Matt Kaufman's The Regulars, and I should go ahead and say that this book it's categorized as a biography, but you go where the research takes you. I mean, you know this, John. You start a new project and you have a vision of what it's going to be, and I envisioned kind of a standard, typical biography. The materials I found didn't support that, and so what it ends up being is really an organizational history of the Army from 1904 to 1944 through the lens of General McNair's career. And that flavor of the book is a result of the nature of the records I found, which are almost exclusively professional in nature. Very little kind of personal. I only found one letter he exchanged with his son, Doug. And that letter had a very short, warmish introduction, and then it was a 2-page exposition on the complex math for a field artillery problem that Doug's working on at West Point, and how he can, solve this problem. And so he's coaching his son on, mathematics. But not a super close, warm kind of interaction at all.
But to add to it a little bit, that maybe it'll give you a little feel for who General McNair was with his family, too. One of the letters I found that is pertinent to this is from Major General Andrew A.D. Bruce, who was Doug McNair's boss, the commander of the 77th Division. And so he's writing a condolence letter to Claire in the aftermath of both their deaths. And he related the story of how he was the one who broke the news to Douglas about what happened to his father. And one of the things that Bruce commented on was just how deeply Douglas loved his father, and how he, as Douglas's boss, picked up on that. And of course, Bruce knew General McNair fairly well and all that. So you had a sense of here was a very tight relationship in its own way, through the professionalism, of course, too, but also as father to son. And that sort of brought him to life for me a little bit as well.
For sure, and absolutely, he deeply loved his wife, Claire. I mean, they were an absolute perfect match. He adored her.
Gentlemen, I'm going to take the last question. I know Mark's answer, but I honestly don't know John's. John, could you answer and then Mark follow up? What's next? What are you working on?
Speaking of generals and trying to get to know them and doing biographies, I'm doing a biography of General Matthew Ridgway, and who I think is outside of Eisenhower, Marshall, maybe MacArthur, is easily the most important American general of the 20th century on many levels, not just because he's an airborne pioneer, but because of all these other posts he's had in a very long career. I mean, I hate to even tell you this after the experience you've just been through, but the Ridgway papers run to about 134 boxes with all this correspondence and whatnot. And that's just, of course, that's just his personal stuff, much less what's in other people's collections. So that's what's on the horizon for me.
And I'll back up one. I love this photograph. So we already talked about General McNair's class ring found after his death. The picture to the left, though, that's General William Simpson. So this is McNair doing an inspection. General Simpson is the commander of the 12th Corps. This is at the Tennessee maneuvers before Simpson is elevated to Army Command. And this inspection is what resulted in McNair deciding to recommend General Simpson for Field Army Command. Simpson's given command of an army in the States, it deploys forward, and is renamed 9th Army when he gets to Europe. So my current project, the first book that will come out is an operational history of the 9th U.S. Army, which I think is just sorely lacking. It's been long, long overdue. Many of you might not know a whole lot about 9th Army. Part of the reason I think that's true for most people is that 9th Army was part of 21st Army Group, working for General Montgomery for most of the time that they were in Northwest Europe. And then at some point down the road, I'd also like to write an actual traditional biography of General Simpson, because I've found plenty of personal papers and early career background and things to make that possible.
Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for John McManus and Mark Calhoun.